I'd like to introduce Joel Miner. Joel is the curator of the Modern Literature Collection and Manuscripts at Washington University in St. Louis. He has led numerous Merrill-related projects over the past 9 years at WashU, including a digital humanities project with Book of Ephraim drafts and Ouija board transcripts, the James Merrill Life and Art digital exhibit, the James Merrill Symposium in 2015, and the digitization of the thousands of photographs in the James Merrill Papers. Please welcome Joel Miner.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to be your host today for what I know will be a fun and stimulating conversation. A special thanks goes out first to the James Merrill House. They're partnering with us on this series of book events, and the April 10th event, the first one they hosted, is available on their YouTube channel. And we will have information at the end of today's program about 2 related events coming up. So I'm going to start with a few words and a short presentation about the James Merrill resources in the Modern Literature Collection at Washington University Libraries. We're really proud of our long association with James Merrill. His generosity and that of his family and friends has made the Modern Literature Collection a much richer resource in more ways than one. We like to call the James Merrill Papers a cradle to grave archive, spanning from the earliest memorabilia such as his christening gown and baby book, through thousands of poem drafts, journals, letters, and photos, to his bronze death mask seen here. Merrill has been the cornerstone of the Modern Literature Collection since it was founded in 1964, when friend and fellow poet Mona Van Dyne personally invited him to deposit his papers here. The collection has grown to 310 boxes, and we continue to acquire correspondence and other materials from his many friends and acquaintances, sometimes adding them to the Merrill Papers, and sometimes creating separate collections. Merrill also left us his literary copyright and an endowment for our special collections, and his Mother's Plummer Foundation has provided us significant grants for Merrill-related projects, events, and acquisitions. As I mentioned, there have been significant growth of the Merrill Papers, as well as related collections through the years. Many friends and family members and heirs contributed material since Merrill's death in 1995, including letters, many of which show up in the whole world. So here are some names. It's not an exhaustive list, but many of them in recent years. And this picture here is of Mona Van Dyne with Merrill and David Jackson and Mona's husband, Jarvis Thurston. Taken in Key West, probably by Peter Hooton, because there's a similar picture with Mona and Peter. I'd like to talk about our online resources really quick. We have many of these, 6 so far. James Merrill Other Writings consists of essays on and images of the different genres of Merrill's writing found in his papers. And we have an exhibit catalog available of this, which is free, and I'm happy to send you one if you just contact me. The James Merrill Digital Archive, materials for the Book of Ephraim, contains all of the Ouija board transcripts that we have, as well as Book of Ephraim drafts. And this is a collaboration with the Humanities Digital Workshop here at WashU, and also includes related materials from the Stephen Yenser papers at the Beinecke Library. And then the Modern Literature Collection, first 50 years, was created, as you might expect, on our 50th anniversary, and includes Merrill correspondence drafts, juvenilia, audio, and video. James Merrill Life and Archive is modeled on the 2015 biography Life and Art by Langdon Hammer, and showcases important archival items that played a role in that book. And we're going to look at a few of those in a few minutes here. James Merrill's Poetry Manuscripts is Tim Mader's ongoing study of drafts and related materials for a more in-depth look at many of his most celebrated poems. And then the photographs from the James Merrill Papers on Art Store is a password-protected collection of all 7,626 scanned photos so far. So we wanted to start the discussion today with looking at a handful of digitized letters that are available online, some of which are in the book and some of which are not. I'll show you what we have. Lauren will put the links to them in the chat, and then I will introduce the panelists and we'll get the conversation started. So first is a note from little Jimmy as a child to his governess, Layla Zelly Howard, whom many of you probably know was an inspiration for Lost in Translation. We have a letter with a photograph to Marilyn Lavin from 1952, which is in the book and came to us more recently from Marilyn Lavin donating materials to us. Two David Jackson items. One, the first piece of correspondence from Merrill to Jackson in 1953, this postcard you see on the left. And then a occasional poem, which is in the correspondence on the occasion of David Jackson's 40th birthday. And we might discuss whether this counts as a letter or not. But it's a great visual. And we have a 1964 letter to Darrell Hine from Athens, Greece. Kind of an interesting, typical typed letter from Merrill, kind of a big block of text. And then a holograph letter written in 1986 to Peter Hooton while Peter was sleeping in the hotel room, and Merrill had some things to get off his chest at the time. So it's a letter written to someone who's in the same room. Now I'll introduce the panelists, and I'm going to leave the slideshow up for now. As I do that, if you all have gallery view on, you'll be able to see all their faces and they can wave when I introduce them. So Langdon Hammer is the Niel Gray Junior Professor of English at Yale University. His books include James Merrill Life and Art and Hart Crane and Alan Tate, Janus-Faced Modernism. He also edited the Library of America volumes of Hart Crane's poetry and Mae Swenson's poems. He writes about poetry for the New York Review of Books and the American Scholar, where he serves as poetry editor. Chelsie Malyszek recently received her PhD in English from Yale University with a dissertation on poetic diction in contemporary poetry. She is a visiting assistant professor at Hampden-Sydney College. Her work has appeared in the Threepenny Review and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Stephen Yenser's most recent volume of poems is Stone Fruit. He has written 3 critical books, including The Consuming Myth, the works of James Merrill, which I unfortunately don't have behind me, but co-edited 5 volumes, including the book of letters of Merrill's writing, and published an annotated edition of Merrill's Book of Ephraim most recently, which I highly recommend. And Timothy Young is curator of modern books and manuscripts at Yale University's Beinecke Library, focusing on modern literary and cultural movements, including the avant-garde, children's literature, financial history, and playing cards and games. He is the author and/or editor of The Great Mirror of Folly, Finance, Culture, and the Crash of 1720, The Uncollected David Rakoff, and Storytime Essays on the Betsy Beinecke Shirley Collection of Children's Literature. So welcome to everybody, and thanks for waiting. And I wanted to maybe start with our co-editors, Stephen and Lanny, and taking a look at our letters we have for the audience and you all today. See if you had anything you wanted to point out about them of interest, and also maybe get into a little bit of your editorial decisions and what went into the book and what didn't.
Sure. But first, for Stephen and I, we have a big thank you and acknowledgement to you, Joel, and to your colleagues present and past for our collaboration. I think, you know, the work that Stephen and I have done is so bound up with and dependent on the work that you do that we're really grateful for this.
Well, thank you.
Amen.
Amen. Um, and thanks for these digital images, which anybody can find with a couple of clicks on the Special Collections website at WashU. I wanted to say a couple of things about them in relation to our book. In part because they show things that are not in the book. And I mean both in the sense that there are letters here that we did not produce in the book, such as that wonderful Valentine to Zelly. Stephen, why didn't we put that in?
I kept wondering about several of these letters that they should have been.
Okay, next edition. So, I mean, this really is a terrific letter, and it demonstrates a couple of things that I guess I want to emphasize about the interest of letters that our book only can capture, perhaps peripherally at best, and that is the kind of materiality of the page. We see here what is lost in transcription, which is the writer's hand. In this case, a child's hand. And this particular letter is so, it is such a charged object that the author, James Merrill, little boy, has kissed it. And he's asking his governess to kiss it where he kissed it so that she can kiss him. And, you know, that catches this, you know, tangible dimension of the letter as an object that is exchanged between people that we, you know, can at best gesture towards in the text that we've made out of these letters.
But one can see here, in addition to the hand and that immediacy, the beginning of the poetic sensibility, as he says here towards the end of the letter. I've been rummaging through my drawers, but I can't find anything to give you but love. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
And that little figure of speech, I think, is terrific. I've been rummaging through my drawers. I mean, that's something that could have come up in a letter 20 years later, or indeed 40 years later. So it's a nice combination of the two things.
And it's one of many that are in our collection of these kind of letters where he is pouring out love for her and apologizing for being naughty and all this stuff.
Yes.
It's really amazing.
There's a sentiment here that is not so obvious in the later Merrill. That is to say, by later Merrill, I mean after he's about 20 years old. So the forthcomingness of this note is something. He liked understatement, of course, famously, and irony and dryness. And so it's wonderful to see this, the heart of things here.
Yeah.
Joel, maybe you could skip ahead to the Daryl Hine letter.
Sure.
From November 17th, 1964. Couple of things I wanted to say about this one, which is a letter I love. It's the first letter in which he introduces his lover, Stratomuflazelis, who he is describing for his friend Daryl Hine, poet, classicist, later editor of Poetry magazine. you can just barely catch it on the screen right now, but along with the kind of materiality of the hand, there's the materiality of the paper that I wish we could reproduce. It's onion skin. You can just see this packed into an airmail letter in 1964 from Athens to, I don't know where Hein was, probably maybe Chicago at that point. And it captures, even in this kind of material way, a kind of era that is no longer part of our lives. Two other things I wanted to say about this one. Notice how Merrill's packed the paper. I mean, that is to say, he's packed the page. This is not unusual. It is as if he took the page as a kind of pre-existing form for his letters and filled it. I think you can sometimes calibrate how he felt both about the addressee and the occasion by how much he filled it, and just how much he wanted to give to this particular letter. You can see in this case, it's a lot. He has a lot to say, and it is a letter that's full of sex, literature, anecdotes, a certain amount of travelogue, and in those ways, if you look at that page crammed with sentences, it is a nice miniature of Merrill's drive to somehow get a whole world into his letters and onto a particular page. It's also a hilarious letter, which I'll just recommend everyone go out and read. 17 November 1964.
It's in the book too.
Yeah, you can buy the book and then read it. But I think it's available on your website, right?
Yes, for sure.
The-
Actually, one more thing I wanted to say about this one is that's typewritten, free form, and there's not a mistake in it.
Is that also a common thing you would see in Merrill's letters? Not many corrections?
Very few.
Right.
He made a few habitual mistakes, but not very many of those. In fact, there's kind of funny story that Chelsie will appreciate. He one word that he misspelled often was cemetery. He used an A at the end instead of an E. And I had in some early versions corrected that, but then we had to say something in the forward about the occasional mistakes that he made. And in order to justify the comment and in order to be fully honest and transparent, I had to go back and use my search function and uncorrect cemetery back to its original misspelling. And it got complicated because once or twice he used he actually got it right. And so I was in some doubt at the end exactly how many of the cemeteries to rectify and how many to just leave. But it worked out.
So you see the important kinds of question that Stephen and I wrestled with.
Hours and hours on that one. And Chelsie was a major contributor to that discussion. The term was texture. We wanted some texture in these letters, and I hope we got it.
Well, yeah, I would like to bring in Chelsie and Tim about seeing these letters and anything. Does it bring anything back for you when working with them? I know that Chelsie wanted to talk about this one in particular to Marilyn.
Good.
Yeah, I think, Stephen, in terms of texture, I think this is one where I feel like we got it really right, because when we transcribed it, we knew we had to do something with this X, right?
Oh,
I am
yes.
here. There's no way we couldn't do it. So in the book, we ended up with sort of parenthetical X drawn from boat image on letterhead to this place in text,
Right.
which is sort of clunky, but I think necessary to know sort of how much paratext, or like, you know, specifically the letterhead that Merrill's writing on really played with his letter. He brought it in a lot.
Yes.
In the late 80s, I think there's a letter to you where he's writing about his Ouija board letterhead. And he's like, wow, look at this. I just got this from one of my friends. And so the things that are outside of the very packed, dense text body are always part of it. And then there's another one that I think is also actually, I think, Joel, you guys also have this, to David Jackson, June 1953. In the margin next to an ink stain, Merrill makes a marginal note that says, excuse spot, which no one would ever think to do. But because his letters are sort of so pristine, so few errors, I think something like that was, you know, he may have just rewritten the letter for all of his concerns about the ink stain. But yeah, I think we actually did have a lot of discussions about texture and making sure these felt like letters without being too overwhelming, because a Merrill letter in itself can be a lot to handle. And so to have too much sort of preserved on the page seemed like it might impede with just reading the letters leisurely. But I think we did a good job, but I'm biased.
I think you did a good job. You know, he cared about this kind of thing, like the spot, the details. He always cared about details. Just one aspect of what Lanny was saying about his attention to the page. And there's you know, there's a wonderful limited edition, special edition of 1002nd Night, which has on the page a sun and a moon. It's a tiny booklet, and but there's a sun and a moon on one page and illustrations, and they're colored. And I wondered if the printer had done it or what. I asked James about it. He said, "Oh no," he said, "I did that myself." And so at least on some of these booklets, he colored in the tiny sun and the tiny moon, so that they would be just so in those, you know, 30 booklets that were sent out to special people. He loved doing special editions and always put his hand in someplace.
And am I right in remembering on this postcard that didn't you notate the Fire Island on the front or the back, however you want to think of it?
We did.
Yeah. Yes.
Just for the audience, this is the first piece of correspondence from Merrill to Jackson, and you can see that it is a message to David, who's gone off to do something in St. Louis, as it happens, and Merrill says, "Old Dave," which is a kind of joke, which we don't exactly know the origin of. "Such a hot day. I wish I could meet an iceberg like the nice man did. When are you coming back?" Or question mark. "I've planned a little evening, Jay." And then on the other side, you've got this vintage postcard where a couple has just encountered each other, I suppose. And I guess the idea is that, you know, when you are really knocked off your feet, you've hit an iceberg. You are the Titanic and about to go down. This is you know, the message that Merrill is sending after he's really just not his first meeting with David Jackson, but maybe his first intimate meeting with David Jackson on Fire Island, not where you expect an iceberg maybe, but where Merrill found his. One of the things I wanted to say about the letters that, you know, I enjoy as a reader of them and enjoyed as an editor of them and enjoyed as a biographer writing about them is that Merrill had so much fun in them. I mean, he wanted to have fun. He used them to have fun. And you really feel that in his, it really enters his correspondence in a kind of fresh way when he starts writing to Jackson. You know, that postcard is a nice instance. His first letter to David is written in a kind of mock child's hand, where he is pretending to write to his uncle Dave, not old Dave, but Uncle Dave, and he's telling a story about his hitchhiking to his father's home on Southampton, where in the course of which the little boy, Jimmy, has had to fend off these various rides that would pick him up and do him no good. And it's a very funny letter that ends then, however, when he switches voices into a kind of intimate and you know, very romantic mode. It's really touching. It's really amusing. And then you've got right here this other letter, which is on the WashU website that Stephen and I did not put in the book. It seems so much an object in itself, and in that sense, maybe somewhat less a letter. It's a poem for David on his 40th birthday. You don't necessarily know that it's the 40th birthday until the conceit is revealed at the end of the poem. He's saying, you know, David, I see that you have been crying. You feel as though you've lost something, but no, you haven't. You know, look at my face or look at the face of your friends, and they will show David, if he still believes he has been robbed by 40 thieves, that in fact he is loved.
Love that little gesture tradition, the illumination of the original letter there, the capital P's, like a medieval manuscript. Tim, when you were collecting these things, did you ever glance in and see something like this and get surprised or shocked?
Yes, I did, and so I'll tell a bit more later, but I was working as an archivist at Beinecke when I was engaged by Sandy and Stephen to help track down letters that were not already at St. Louis. And yes, I did, Stephen, except for, you know, as an archivist, I'm trained to not stop and read everything. Otherwise, I wouldn't get anything done. So I would see these things. And especially, I have to tell you, I was struck whenever I was getting letters from the 60s and 70s, those really, really tight typewritten ones, because those were ones I could just quickly, you know, glance. And as Lanny said, they were full of really interesting details, right? So I was looking through them and names and stuff like that. But then what really struck me is that when we got to the point where we had made copies and you and Sandy had asked to have a chronologic set. So there was a big, me and several students were sorting, and we got them and we saw like, oh, here's 4 letters from June 1st, 1970. And they're all sort of variations of each other. So you started to see that he was sort of telling some of the same stories, but then couching this one a little bit more ribald for this person. And this one was a little bit more just like repertorial. So that's what got me. And I started to read and think about, okay, it's letter writing, but it's also, you know, it's narrative composition. Yeah. And that's what I started to see.
I don't understand, just by the by, how you could ever do that. I could never be an archivist. I'd get hooked by one of those references and just read on. And so thank you again. You wouldn't believe the amount of work that Tim did. And what I think of as an army of elves who must have helped him, but I suspect it was mostly Tim, without whom nothing.
Lanny has a hand raised, so we should call on him.
Lanny.
You're muted though. You're muted, Lanny.
That was so that you wouldn't hear the Yale Carillon when it was playing a few moments ago. I just looked in the Q&A, and there's a question about whether Sandy McClatchy was involved, if at all, in this project. indeed, Sandy really got this going to begin with. And Tim, maybe you could talk about that because you worked very closely with him.
Yeah, and I'll sort of just I'll keep with the sort of the points of the matter, because I could go on at length about Sandy, and each of us could, about his effect on our lives. So the brief story is that shortly after James Merrill passed away, Sandy, who I met one time, came into the Beinecke library, and I guess he had heard that I was a new person who had just been there a short while. And so he came to me and he said, "Oh, we've met, and would you like to help me do something?" He says, "James Merrill's passed away, and I am working with Stephen Yenser to arrange the estate, and we need to ship some things to St. Louis, but we also need to give some gifts to friends in accordance to his will." I said, "Okay." So he hired me to go to the apartment or the building on Water Street in Stonington. And so I started off by going every weekend for 2 months in 1995 and working through the apartment and basically cataloging all the books, finding all the letters, manuscripts, pieces stuffed in drawers, and looking at things, and also making a list of, the mechanical peacock, and I mean, all these things, which for me, I didn't read much Merrill as an undergraduate, an English literature major. So I sort of had this learning experience, life experience, archival experience all at once, and it was wonderful and transformative. But I have to say that it was the main driver there was Sandy McClatchy, who extended his hand in friendship and also mentorship to me, which was one of the most important things ever in my life. But anyway, so after we did that, and we had worked with Stephen to make the bequest, make the disbursements and the shipments to mainly, I think, the books. Half the books and all the manuscript materials went to St. Louis. Sandy came back and said, "Well, the next project is to do the collected letters. And what do you think about that?" And I thought, I'm an archivist, sure. It's like, what, 30, 40 letters? Yeah. and then he said, "Okay, well, here to, I held these back from Washington for a little while. Oh, no, sorry. So he made photocopies of 2 telephone books. And he said, just contact everybody in these telephone books and ask them if they have letters." I was like, okay. So we worked up a approach letter together. And then I also made a list of libraries. So basically for 3 years, what I did was I just looked at my notes. I had this massive, very old fashioned database, which somehow survived over the years, being translated into newer editions and stuff like that. I wrote to 85 libraries and nearly 300 people to ask if they had letters written by Merrill. And we placed an ad in New York Review of Books. Word of mouth went out. People just out the transom. And I had a PO box at the Yale station. I just got something that says, "A friend of mine said you're looking for Merrill letters." And either I got copies or I got the originals. And so the question was, okay, what do we do? We were in communication with your predecessors at St. Louis to ask about these things. About half the people said, "Oh, actually, feel free to then give the originals to St. Louis." Some of the people just sent letters, copies, no more communication. Some people were really important. I wrote to about 6, 7, 8, 10 times. Sandy, I think maybe Stephen, maybe you called them, you politely nudged them. And we got thousands of letters. And then question was, okay, if it would have been 30 or 40 letters, it's like, boom, let's transcribe them. But they were just so wonderful and beautiful and voluminous. And we needed to make 2 copies and then chronologically rearrange and then make 2 copies. So there's, I think, 4 master sets, right? One that's alphabetical and one that's chronological, one in LA with you, and one that actually was in Sandy's house in Stonington, but then after his passing, it went to the Yale Review, but then it's been moved somewhere else, I think, Chelsie. Where is it?
I'm not sure where it is, but it was at the Review when I was working there a couple of years ago.
Okay,
it's my last known location for me.
Right. So anyway, so that was it, and I could talk more about what it meant, but I was trained as an archivist, and the experience for me, besides that sort of immersion in the world of Merrill, and the important thing was that it put me on the other side of the desk. As an archivist, I was trained, I was young, I thought I knew everything I was going to about research libraries, and here's what people want. But when you become a researcher and you're approaching people, many different people who don't know who I am, and you're asking for letters or permission to get copies and like that, it made me realize what that both ways of the communication for doing research was about. Because also, I was working for the estate held copyright. There's this interesting thing, sometimes the library says, well, we have copyright as well. So I had to negotiate with them and say, well, yes, with all due respect, but I'm working for the executors. And that turned out to be actually very easy. But whenever, and also, it's like, send a check for $1.25 for all these copies. So, I could share my checkbook because I paid them out of my own, account for $1.25 and then I got reimbursed, but it wasn't actually an experience. So now I think I understand how researchers are doing work, and I've actually had to ask the questions about access and research and copyright. And then, it went on. I did about 3 years solid work, and then maybe about 3 years sort of on and off work until maybe like the early 2000s. But then I think maybe Stephen, you can talk about this, is that a lot of your attention went to the collected poems and other works. So it's not a matter of neglect that the correspondence took so long. There's just so much work that was already in sort of like a master plan for Merrill, that the letters actually, it needed some time to gestate, and things came out of the woodwork, and you needed to sort of read the letters and sort of like figure out which ones were the best ones that wanted to be represented to tell the story. It's like a parallel biography, right? So autobiography, it does this thing. So, but it was fun.
And Tim, you had so many copies of those letters, as you say, there were at least four.
Yeah.
That I came as we were nearing the end of the book of letters, the selection, and really at a turning point. I happened to be in my garage one day, and I found a big box, with your return address.
Yeah.
And I opened it up, and here are these letters. There must have been 300 letters, and I thought, my God, and we've already got 400 pages of letters. What are these? And I got them out and I looked through them and I finally figured out that they were ones that were done chronologically. So they were all duplicated, but I mean, it terrified me that we had found this cache of letters, probably the most crucial ones he ever wrote, were sitting here rotting in my garage. But day after day, these things would come in from Tim. It was astounding. Anyway.
Yeah. We sent you that's why we had two sets to Steve about the letters, Stephen, to keep you honest. We want to make sure we had the set of a record, and then we had yours. It all worked out.
Stephen, I'm curious, as you and Sandy as co-executors, did you have any indication of an expectation from Merrill himself that there would be any kind of published letter, or that you should gather them, or was this all your own initiative?
Well, I think anybody who knew James, no, that's not true. A few people who knew him very well knew all along that he wanted his letters published. Mm-hmm. It was, or he wanted them retained anyway, and somebody else could do what they wanted to with them. But this just infused all of his letter writing. Those were letters written for posterity. He had a lot of fun doing it, but he knew that they would be collected. So it went without saying. And everything he did, was in regard to epistles, was directed to that end. Look at that letter that you have from to Peter Hooton while he's sleeping.
Uh-huh.
This note to Peter never got sent through the mail. Mm-hmm. And very personal, but fascinating for the biographer. And there it is. Now, how did that get saved? See, it's James had a big box beside his desk, and he put manuscripts and letters and things into that box, and then they went off to St. Louis. So he would have saved this letter. Peter Hooton probably did not, but or maybe he did. I don't know. Anyway, but this is a letter that was not a letter; it was a note to his lover, and but it got saved.
Mm-hmm.
Everything got saved. James, waste not, want not, was one of his major rules. He saved, he preserved.
Yeah.
Not just things about him, but things having to do with other people too.
That got me curious too. Like, after 64, when he started depositing papers at an archive here, do you think he got a little bit more performative, or a little, did that affect the content of the letters? Do you think? No.
No, I think it was there from the beginning. He knew whatever. Mona Van Dyne had such great foresight, and she was very lucky too. But somehow those letters would have been one day would have come, if not to you, to Yale or to somebody else, as indeed they did. I didn't see any change at all in the letters. He wasn't writing for anybody any differently. Lanny, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, well, these are people who, read letters, that is to say, published letters, for whom a writer's letters were part of who they were and the work that they did. So that you see that self-consciousness in various ways. There's a postscript that David Jackson writes in a letter that James Merrill writes to Claude Fredericks in, I believe, 56, in which David jokes with Claude about future biographers reading the letter that he's writing the postscript to. And so that's in 1956. So he's already kind of thinking about this. They've read Henry James, the Aspirin Papers. This is part of what the literary lives that they're creating entail. However, that said, I think there are a couple of things about Merrill. While there's a acute self-consciousness at all times, I think that there's a kind of that is so naturalized on his part that that there's no inauthenticity. There's no sort of looking over his shoulder when he's writing. It is a kind of performance that is just part of everything he writes.
There's still some sincere and letters to his friends at the same time there.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And relatedly, what I find very interesting is that as Stephen is saying, Merrill kept maybe not everything, but he cleared a lot of his desk to put it in that box that went to St. Louis. Although you could say it's interesting, some of the things he didn't send. He didn't send a lot of his financial records, for instance. But be that as it may, he sent a lot of his life and a lot of the ways in which his life connected to very many other people. And he put very few restrictions on it. That is to say, he didn't, although he was creating an archive, he didn't tell us what to do with it.
Yeah, that's for other people to figure out. So I wonder.
I think it's really admirable. I think he really did not try to, in that sense, shape his image in ways that you see people doing all the time. He gave a lot of material for readers, for biographers, for archivists to do what they would with it.
I want to get a little bit more from Chelsie. When you came in, I get the impression from the book that you were really heavily involved from, turning the letters from manuscript or typescript into what we see in the book. And could you go a little bit into what all you did with letters?
I would love to. I'm sure Lainey and Stephen will make it sound like I did even more than I did. But I got involved in fall of 2015 when I was a recently defected medievalist to contemporary poetry. Lainey won that war. And I was just talking about wanting some research assistant work, and Lainey overheard me. And he's like, well, I've got something to keep you occupied. And so, dozens and dozens of boxes of letters later, I think we laid them all out in Lanny's office he was moving into. So Lanny, you couldn't occupy it for months because I just had letters everywhere. But yeah, I think it was taking this sort of repositories Tim's talking about of these photocopies and going through them and making sense of them based on sort of an ever-changing list of letters that we knew were from somewhere and then had to locate and typing them up. So, I'm young to the venture, only having worked on it for 5 years, but really I think just transcribing the letters is where I came in most prominently, and helping with the notes, which were very fun. That might have been the most fun part for me.
Well, the notes, you were crucial on a number of occasions, and I do want you to tell us about the light bulb.
So I think there should be a photo of this somewhere, but let me find the letter here. Okay, so there's a letter to Elizabeth Bishop in 1972, and there's this one reference that we could not figure out, and it's to a Geo Price bulb. So in context, it says it's about W.H. Auden and Chester Coleman's very messy apartment, which is interesting because John Updike said that James Merrill lived in dignified clutter. So this is sort of telling that Merrill thought that Auden's apartment was sort of a sty. He says, David Jackson says, won't you miss New York? He asked Auden, whose fond gaze thereupon took in cracked picture glass, disemboweled sofa, piles of sooty papers everywhere, the kitchen's iris of roaches shimmering faintly in the light of a Geo Price bulb. And so through some very strategic Googling, and honestly, I think just days of refusing to give up.
Geo period.
Geo period. Price. Yes, bulb. I figured out this was cartoonist George Price, who
there we go.
Yes, he signed Geo Price. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, and he had these very sort of zany light bulbs that were always, there's wires coming down. This is very characteristic one, and his cartoons are often in domestic spaces that are not ideally kept up. So yeah, that's what I think certainly Stephen and Lanny think is my greatest victory in the book, and I'll certainly take it. But we all had good notes, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Stephen correctly identified Bumble Dawson. That was impressive.
Oh well, yeah. Well, Lanny, you did. I don't know how to get at your discovery of the reference to a letter in which James is recounting a wedding. I don't know who's watching this. We can't go into that. Anyway, you can see what research leads to. It's a wonder we're still sane. Joel, you had a lot of stuff you wanted to get over today, and I think we've crowded a bunch out. What do you need to tuck in?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the time, and we're at 4:51. I want to be aware of people's time. We may go over past the hour if whoever wants to stick around, if that's okay.
Yeah, great.
And I do want to get to any audience questions in the Q&A. It looks like we have a few, and we addressed one about Sandy McClatchy. There's one here from Mark Harrington. Hello, wonderful panel. I would love for you guys to speak a little bit about how Merrill's letters serve to capture event and time as diary, journal, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he said in one of his letters to, I think it was to Irma Brandeis, that she asked him about his notebook, his diary that he was keeping when he was traveling. He said, I can't do a diary. The letters have to bear the whole burden. And so rather than diaries, he wrote letters. And again, he knew somehow those letters would be kept. And, you know, he never had to tell his friends that these letters should be kept. Anybody looking at them could tell this was a letter to be kept. And so his descriptions of landscapes, of paintings, of pieces of music, it's all there.
And Lanny, am I right in thinking his journals, a lot of were more for drafting poems than today this and that happened? Or?
Well, I mean, you know, the diaries are so, or notebooks are so different because they're wonderful. And they are a kind of view of Merrill that you don't get elsewhere. They are, as it were, him thinking to himself on the page. And what is so marvelous and different about the letters is that he is thinking for someone else. He is, Mark asked about, you know, how the letters capture a moment or a place, and they do. And there's a kind of drive or urgency that he feels, as well as a kind of opportunity to somehow communicate the moment that he is in with his correspondent. And so they're very much about kind of, yeah, sharing a place in a moment and a day, et cetera. And it's part of the effect that you have in his letters of a kind of intensity of personal presence.
That's a little bit more intense in the letters than in the journals.
Different. I mean, you know, as I say, the letter is a kind of you could say almost a kind of collaboration with an addressee. That is, it's a kind of dialogue and monologue form in which a moment is being shared, and there's all kinds of, you know, personal performance involved in that, and also Merrill's also entertaining himself.
The one thing that strikes me, Lanny's right, of course, about the difference between the notebooks and the letters, but one thing that always strikes me about James's work is how one genre bleeds into the other. And so it's not uncommon for him to break off in a letter, especially as he gets older, and to take up a different subject, or stop himself and revise what he was just saying, as he might in a notebook. Sometimes drafts of poems appear in the letters, not too often, but sometimes. And in his notebooks, you will find recipes, bits of recipes, telephone numbers of friends. They were not just, you know, something you would sit down at the end of a day like his friend Claude Fredericks would do and record the whole day or something, but it was really, notebooks would catch up anything. And I think if it could be written, it was a part of his life. And it was a part, and so the notebooks became the letters, got in, and that got into the poems. The language is this great sea that he swims about in. And the genres are not all that distinct often.
I would like to plug just for a second on the sort of recipe thing. One of my favorite moments in these letters is to you, Stephen, where he gives you a recipe for an omelet souffle.
Yes.
Which I have made multiple times, and it is excellent.
It works.
Highly recommend. It's very good. He had good taste.
Yeah.
Another reason to get the book.
Yes. And Stephen, you mentioned in the last event about the kind of experience of receiving letters from Merrill. And you know, I think I'd love to hear a little bit more about your. I mean, he was your teacher. You know, he was, you know, a fellow poet, but also 20 some years older, right? And
15.
Probably looked up to him. 15. You know, was there any kind of intimidation factor, or I mean, was it like, how did it feel like writing to James Merrill? You know, like I would be intimidated.
Oh God, yes. It got easier over the years. See, much of our relationship was was in correspondence because we didn't often live in the same town, although we did. And so I got used to it after a while, but yes, terribly intimidating. I mean, look at those letters. And then, early on, he would kid me about my letters. I remember him saying something to me once about how he could see I'd been setting that pun up for a couple of paragraphs. And it was true, he was a good reader, and he saw exactly what I was doing. It's transparent to him. So, that's doubly intimidating. But eventually I kind of got used to it. And getting his letters was, it's like, I don't know, getting a great periodical. You just sit down and be entertained for the day. And we would write about the work we were doing, which is one thing that we didn't get in the book, which I regret sometimes. There is very little in the book of letters about technical work, about the specifics, about the hammers, the nails, the screws of the poems. And James was an excellent reader. He was an excellent critic. He helped a lot of people with a lot of poems and novels, the details, and it's not there. And we made a decision to keep some of that out, a lot of it out, because a lot of people wouldn't be interested. They're more interested in gossip and in the puns and, so that's another book.
Yeah, as someone said in the chat. Yeah, I was curious about that. If you had to cut a letter because you have this editorial principle to keep the whole letter in, and so if there's just one or two sentences you'd really love to have, but the rest of it,
yes,
you just can't go in.
I'm glad we made that decision early on, because if we hadn't, we would have spent a lot of time later cutting up letters, which just would have been impossible. We were very fortunate in that regard to have made that decision.
I have to ask, any fights come up between you two?
Oh,
you could or not?
Never.
Never? No.
No, all the time. What do you mean? Yeah, of course.
You've heard him.
No, okay,
No.
that's good. You're gentle on each other.
No, Lanny's he's got his perfection aside. He tries to hide it, but it's there. And sure, we disagreed about any number of things. There's a lot of fun.
Almost everything.
And when I was in Stonington, we go have some drinks and continue.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just looking at the Q&A here. Henry Cole is asking about, can we say more about the death mask? That's always a popular topic.
I can say something very quickly about it. The death mask was made in New York after Merrill's body was brought there from Arizona, and it was made at Peter Hooton's decision. There was no instruction for that from James Merrill.
And then Peter had it bronzed as well, right?
I assume so.
Oh, yeah. Randy Bean from the James Merrill House in WashU wants to know what's next for our co-editors. Any more Merrill projects in the works? Are you not answering that right now?
Yeah, Chelsie and I thought about approaching Lanny to do all the postcards.
Yeah, I stand behind that.
Recto and verso.
I like that idea, the complete postcards. There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm down.
So that's,
did you guys entertain the notion of reproducing any of the correspondence, in addition to or instead of photos of correspondence? And what if?
You mean in the book? Or?
In the book, yeah.
Yeah, we thought about it. There was just so much to do.
Yeah.
I hope this is not utterly irrelevant. It struck me that that we should mention at some point the wonderful bibliography that Jack Hagstrom did of Merrill's work. It's a descriptive bibliography, and he put it together with the help of a friend or two. And it's a wonderful bibliography. I mean, it catalogs the blurbs that Merrill wrote for books. You want to know which books Merrill blurbed? You can find them all here. It catalogs the books that are dedicated to Merrill, the poems that are dedicated to Merrill. It's everything having to do with Merrill that Jack could get his hands on, he did, and he put it together in this wonderful bibliography, which the bibliographer's task is one I do not understand. I do stand in awe of. And I think that anybody doing any work on Merrill ought to look at Hagstrom's book. There are riches untold there.
That's a good plug. Let's see.
Was a question about Merrill's correspondence. I suppose the other side of Merrill's correspondence was in particular with W.H. Auden. And I've never seen a letter that Merrill wrote to Auden or one from Auden to Merrill. One thing that strikes me about his letters is that the great majority of them are written to intimate friends with whom he had very developed personal relationships. And there's less what I would describe as sort of public seeming correspondence in his letters. And so in fact, there are not a lot of grand names, I think, in his correspondent list. He's one of the correspondences that I think he was more self-conscious about was his letters to Mary McCarthy, whom he regarded as a name that was up in marquee lights, and I think there's a certain kind of stiffness that you feel in the letters that he writes to her. He was much more comfortable writing to people who either were his friends, his intimate friends, or who could be in some way made to feel on some level intimate, and in that sense, almost a more private kind of communication.
Yeah, the one of the few letters to McCarthy that we have in the book responds to her questions about some poems in one of his books, and he treats her as he treats nobody else. He goes down the list of questions. You can tell he doesn't say that, but just answering questions about what something stands for or represents, or and it's like a response to an exam. Almost the answers he gives about these poems to McCarthy, and it's very funny. I don't know what it says about the relationship.
There's a question here that I'll adapt a little bit. How do you speculate a little bit about how Merrill would have taken to social media, texting, email, all that stuff that we do nowadays, and instead of writing letters?
Well, he loved the computer. I think he would be a mean tweeter.
Oh, amen.
Yeah, he would be. There would be a learning curve though. Like when he first gets his electric and his word processor, there's letters that we have where he's like, help, this machine, I don't know what to do. But he would be into it, I think.
And you mean an avid tweeter, right, Lanny? Not a aggressive, because we have enough of those.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no one would ban him. Yeah. People would welcome his tweets.
Seriously, the letter form, I think more and more is on the way out. I don't get any letters anymore. I mean, occasionally I get a letter. I got an email the other day from an old friend apologizing for not writing a letter. but I mean, these could be really the last great letters. I mean, these are letters, but you don't see this kind of thing anymore. And I can't think of another genre, literary genre, that has just disappeared in the last couple of 100 years. So it's a sad thing, I think.
Stephen, so I don't know if you remember, but one of the early dinners we had in Stonington when I first started gathering some of the letters, and it was a very lovely, rollicking evening at the small restaurants. We talked about a lot of things, but I think at one point in the dinner, and it was you, me, Sandy, my boyfriend, and so just for us, and we're talking about letters and what we'd found. And then Sandy said, well, when he drafted this, and you said he drafted this, I said, what? And then Sandy turned to me and said, I mean, of course you draft your letter before you then write out the complete version. It's like, and I realized, it's like, oh my God, that's what an adult does. And since then, seriously, because he took it seriously, and it was like a little mini lesson, like he always liked to give, that it's like, oh, I'm running a letter. You draft a letter like you draft any piece of writing, and then you write it, so it flows as a final version. And that was a very important thing to do. But that's another thing to do. That is it something that's just completely sort of organic and spontaneous, or is it like a piece of creative writing like other more formal forms? And I think that I see as also a break about how much thought goes into that final version of a letter.
Of course, yeah, that would be true for me. For example, my letters to James would go through several drafts, but James never. He wrote with what one of his characters is said to have an unrelenting fluency, and that was James. He didn't draft letters. He didn't have to. He just it's extraordinary. Mm-hmm. The way the mind and the fingers worked with Merrill.
I would see some in his journals. I don't know if any you remember, and maybe rough drafts, but I think probably the more difficult ones to write, maybe, that took a little bit more finesse.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said that so exclusively, but he did not. I mean, he didn't really draft letters, at least not the way I drafted letters. Mm-hmm. But then that's a weird way. So, yeah.
I see in the chat that Brandon is asking about secrecy in the letters, and in particular, the way in which the letters do or do not disclose Merrill's HIV diagnosis. And before I was talking about Merrill's remarkable readiness to have all of his writing archived and relatively open and available. And I think I'd have to qualify that a little bit to say that he's also, very careful about what he says about certain things, and his HIV diagnosis is one of them. I mean, you can read the published letters in our book, and you can see various moments of acknowledgement, but they're not very explicit. The only occasions, the single occasion that I know of where he indicates in very explicit terms that he has HIV is in his notebook entry when he's reacting to his first test result in 1986. And I suppose you could say that the absence of more explicit or specific reference to his diagnosis in his letters subsequent to that is a kind of self-censorship, or at any rate, let's just call it carefulness, that shows, a certain kind of consciousness about not wanting to put in writing something he doesn't want read.
Yes, that is the one actually area that I can think of. I think it's singular but he was indeed fierce about that. And people knew inevitably that he was ill, but he didn't always know that they knew. And I remember his getting furious with a rather distant relative who seemed to have let the cat out of the bag, which in fact, the person was just saying something a lot of people had suspected for a long time. But James is absolutely furious that this would become knowledge. And I think it's the superego, huh? His mother. Right there, always thinking about what if my mother knows, what is it going to do to her, and to her circle of friends, and the impact on all of that. So that is the one thing he was very careful about. I think otherwise he was very honest and straightforward, like, depending on the correspondent.
There's a question here from Willard Spiegelman about how about sensitivity to other people's personal lives? Did you decide not to include any because of that?
No.
No.
Are you not going to say? Yeah, that's.
No, Lanny and I don't have that sensitivity. Kelly Yenser is asking, has anyone here written to James using the Ouija board on the other side after he left us? The Ouija board is, I guess, another, obviously, a big aspect of correspondence in Merrill's life that is a whole other topic. It is. Was the question, has anybody been in touch with James?
Yeah, it's over the Ouija board.
Probably. The people who began using the Ouija board after James came out of that particular closet is extraordinary. All kinds of people went crazy about the Ouija board. They loved it, and here it had been officially sanctioned. It was even literary, And I'm sure that a lot of people have been in touch with something over there that says they are JM, but I haven't heard about it.
I'll just add that, I mean, the handwritten Ouija board and the cracked teacup ended up at Beinecke because Sandy was interested in a few objects also being populated there. And we put it on display. We had a new acquisition show about 6 years ago, and people were either absolutely fascinated or like terrified because the Ouija board, the first thing if they know Merrill, they think of a Merrill. Otherwise, they think of The Exorcist, right? So it was like the two objects that sort of like just sat there and caused intense emotion when people saw them. A lot of it was affection, but a lot of it was, and I remember asking Sandy, saying, "Was it all true?" And he said, "I don't know, Tim. Was it all true?" I mean, and because I at Water Street, I read all of The Changing Light of Sandover, and saw Mirabelle looking at me. So yeah.
Well, we live in the age of QAnon, so probably all those people were at the Beinecke. Looking at the Ouija board. Yeah.
But it did occur to me when reading the book that that the Ouija board really is it's part of Merrill's love of corresponding with
Yes. Well, he calls the letters love letters from the other world. That's how he speaks of the transcripts.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All ties together.
And in his early poem, which is one of the first poems where I think he's kind of trying to process some of the Ouija board stuff from the cupola, he retells the story of Eros and Psyche, and Eros and Psyche communicate by letters.
And you can see the letters to his mother where he's communicating what he's learning about that Ephraim is telling him. He's kind of spilling it out to her.
Yeah, that was a very important letter in the book. I think he was so clear to her about how it worked, and that was a necessary letter in the book. This is the way it goes, and very helpful.
Well, and he says, think what you will, I believe it all. And he probably would take that back, the next day. But it's interesting, in fact, that he wants to assert that to his mother.
Yes.
And make the point.
Well, a number of us, I think, saw James when he was really in the heat of the correspondence with the other world. And you can't fake that kind of feeling about something's out there. And I remember talking to him and being impressed by the degree to which he had a faith that something was talking to him. He didn't know what it was. Now, of course, at the same time, often he would say that he was ambivalent, as he was about everything. But you'd see these intense, hot moments where he was worried about what he was in touch with.
Well,
Okay, go ahead, Joel.
yeah, I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to address any other questions that have been raised or say anything else. I don't want to, I hate to cut it off, but I also don't want to, keep people forever. Lauren, does that? Go ahead.
I'll just say, I just noticed a question about elitism in the world of the Ouija board. And I'll just say, while we're talking about the Ouija board, there's a lot of stuff in there. And not all of it is pretty attractive or otherwise approvable. What do we do with that? That's a kind of big question. I would invite anyone who's interested in that question to read James Merrill's letters and see what you think about what the person who wrote those letters thinks.
Good advice.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank my panelists. This has been a lot of fun. Just
thank you, Joel, for putting this all together, and
my pleasure, for sure.
That your archive, it really is. It's wonderful to get little glimpses of it. The way in which things run so smoothly and beautifully at WashU is impressive. I mean, I'm sure the same must be true at Yale, but I'm more familiar with Yale. Yeah. Anyway.
We all support each other. I mean,
all right.
the pursuit of greater knowledge of literature.
That's right. Yeah, and then that's another fun aspect of this is the collaborative nature with Beinecke and the Merrill House.
Do you have at WashU everything that the Beinecke has? Objects aside, in correspondence, do you have copies?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know the extent of the collaboration there.
Because you have, I mean, we got a lot that Nancy Cole gave us for the website of letters to you and journals about Ephraim, which was just amazing. Because those were like the first kind of the when it was at its starting stages and really formative years. So we have those on our website. We did get the letters to Sandy McClatchy that Sandy and Lanny sent after the 2015 symposium here, which we put in, which is of course great to have. But yeah, and there are other, and I think that's another great thing about your book is it really shows the range of repositories that have Merrill materials.